considering the acts of worship and worship as a way to identify the church, we've been looking at giving. And last 2 weeks, we actually had been looking at the nature of God's giving as a example for us, right? Look at who he is as God, and then as Ephesians chapter 5 tells us that we're to be imitators of God as beloved children, so we're seeking to imitate God in all things. And giving is one of those areas where we should be imitating God. Now we go back and we look at the nature of God's giving. We look at all the characteristics of God. And we know that there's no way that in any of them can we hope to come close to his perfect nature, right? In his love, his sacrifice, service, whatever it may be, his perseverance, patience, kindness, right? So, nevertheless, we're still called to do that. And when it comes to giving, certainly we all understand that we don't have the ability to give the way that, or in the same kind of way that God gives, in amount, so forth. But that doesn't mean that we can't follow the principles of his giving, which we can all do that. And I think that is, again, the main point of what we're trying to understand when it comes to our giving, is that we don't allow anything to determine what we give without first having these principles instilled within our heart. Too often when people give, they give according to maybe what a congregation has. They give according to their future plans. They have other things ahead of this, right? It's like, why do you contribute the amount that you contribute? And I know the examples that we have in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, we're told to give as we have prospered. So certainly there's a guideline there, right? What is it that you've prospered? And give according to that. And we're never told an amount to give, right? We're not told a certain dollar amount to give of what we prosper. Just give as we have prospered. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6, we have the idea of, or chapter 9, we have the idea of giving according to cheerfully, right? Sacrificially, we give those characteristics. And those go back to the characteristics of giving. And again, we're not told a dollar amount. We're told that he who sows sparingly will reap sparingly. He who sows bountifully will reap bountifully. So rather than it being a dollar amount, there's characteristics that are given there. A bountiful planting, a bountiful harvest. You know, a sparing planting, a sparingly in your harvest. So and those are things that you can actually, that each one of us can actually achieve. We can all sow bountifully, right? We can all give cheerfully. We can all give without it being by compulsion, right? And then going back and looking at the nature of God's giving, we can follow that same kind of practice, those characteristics. And that's what we've been looking at. So today what we're going to consider is this idea of the nature of our Christian giving following the examples that we see in God's character. So let's begin by looking over in Ephesians chapter 5 again. And this is the foundation of what we're talking about here. So in Ephesians 5:1, therefore be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love, just as Christ also loved you and gave himself up for us, an offering and sacrifice to God as a fragrant aroma. So one of the characteristics we noted in regards to God's giving is that he is a sacrificial giver. Well, in this passage of Ephesians chapter 5:1, when we're told to be imitators of God, he brings in this idea of imitating God in his love. And then he demonstrates to us, or shows us, the love that God has for us as seen in his Son. Just as, right, be imitators of God as beloved children and walk in love. Okay, how? In what manner? What should it look like? just as Christ also loved you and gave himself up for us. So then the idea is to imitate the characteristics of Christ's love. No, we're not going to do the exact same thing. We're not going to the cross, right? We're not going to go to the cross and die for other human beings. That's not what we're called to do. Only Christ was called to do that. But we can emulate and imitate in our life the characteristics of that love, the selfless nature of it, right? The sacrificial nature. Because he says in conclusion of verse 2, an offering and a sacrifice to God as a fragrant aroma. So Jesus, following that example, being imitators of God, we should love then in a sacrificial way, in a way that is pleasing to God. So trying to then emulate that when it comes to our giving, then we should possess those same type of characteristics. So if you go over to 1 Corinthians, chapter 16, and note the command here, right? So Paul says, now concerning the collection of the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so do you also. On the first day of every week, each one of you is to put aside and save as he may prosper, so that no collections be made when I come. So here is then an example of following the nature of God's giving. One, God is a giver, right? God is a giver. So if God is a giver, then following his nature would require us to be what? Givers. Yeah. So the first foundational principle then is, if God is a giver, or since God is a giver, and we're to imitate that, then we need to be givers as well. Now, God gives in so many different ways to us, and so do we. We don't always give the same way. It's not always just about money. Certainly in the context of what we're talking about in worship, yes. But God gives us more than financial blessings, right? So he gives us spiritual blessings, so forth. So when we look at our giving is not just simply limited to finances. It's much broader than that, just like God's giving is much broader than financial. But the principle is still there. God is a giver, and so he calls us to be givers as well. Let's go over to Matthew chapter 25. So we cannot expect to be children of God and be imitators of his as beloved children if we're unwilling to follow his nature of giving. If I'm someone who is selfish in my time, selfish in my efforts, selfish in my finances, then I'm not being an imitator of God, because he was never selfish in any of those areas, in any area. So Matthew chapter 25, verse 34. 25, 34. Then the king will say to those on his right hand, come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. Naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. The righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? And when did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and come to you? The king will answer and say to them, truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even the least of them, you did it to me. Let me ask you something. When you're looking at what Jesus is saying to these individuals and telling them to come and to receive the kingdom prepared for them from the foundation of the world, he says the reason you're receiving this is why? In this context, why? Verse 35. So verse 34, he says, the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world, for Yes. In other words, you can say, for you were imitators of God. You were givers. So in all of these things he's saying here, it's them giving something. What did they give? Give me an example. And don't tell me what it says here they give. Give me a different word of what they gave.
They met his needs.
They
met his needs.
Okay, they met the needs. So they gave what?
Their time.
They gave time. Okay. Where do you see them giving time in here?
Well, if they gave him something to drink, that meant that they went and bought something that he could drink.
Look what he says in verse 36. I was sick and you, I was in prison and you. They gave time. Okay, when did they give for their physical needs? I was thirsty, I was hungry, I was naked, you clothed me. So when you're looking at this, this is a list of these Christians imitating the nature of God in their giving. They gave of their time, they gave of their money, they gave of themselves. And Jesus is saying, you will inherit the kingdom of God because you were this kind of people. Because you were a people who imitated my nature and you were givers. Now, that's not the whole crux of it. Certainly, it's not the whole crux of it. But in this account here, he doesn't say, come and inherit the kingdom because you were baptized. Certainly, that's true. Because you believed in me. Certainly, that's true. Because you confessed. Certainly, that's true. Because all of those things are true. Here, he focuses specifically on how they treated other people. The nature, yeah. The nature of their actions was selfless. They gave of their time, of their money, of their treasure, their possessions, right? They gave those up to other people. So God is a giver, and obviously, according to this, he expects us to follow that nature and be givers as well. Givers of our finances, givers of our time, givers of whatever it may be. Look over in 1 Timothy chapter 6. So this is then us putting into practice God's nature in our own life. So we say, how can I be a giver? How can I be a giver like God? How do I imitate that? Well, give of your time. Give of your possessions, right? Give of your wisdom. Give of your knowledge. Share that with others. 1 Timothy chapter 6. And then let's look down in verses 17 through 19. Instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be conceited or to fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. So right there you have this example of God being the giver, right? He richly supplies. God does. Instruct them to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, storing up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is life indeed. Well, that right there falls right back onto what we saw in Matthew chapter 25. When he tells them to storing up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, that's what Jesus is saying. That's what you did. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. When I was naked and you clothed me. When I was sick, you visited me. In prison, you came to me. We are storing up for ourselves this foundation for the future. And that moment is the future that Paul is writing about here in 1 Timothy. And he's telling these Christians here that if you are, and it doesn't necessarily say, well, if you're wealthy, be ready to share, right? That's what he says here. So instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be conceited. Well, yeah, I'm not rich, so he's not talking to me. This is a specific issue he's dealing with, right? And everybody is required to be imitators of God. Every Christian who's called, who so chooses to walk this path, takes on that responsibility. So, and I suppose you could say rich is a relative term, because if I go back and look at some of the people that might have been considered rich in the first century, they're probably in poverty in our society. Not everybody. Certainly there were people who had great wealth in the first century. But, you know, when you go out of the country and you visit you don't even have to go out of the country. You can say in America, and you can go to places where you can see a lot of people that are really poverty-stricken, right? They don't have much of anything. And so I suppose rich could be a relative term. But we're not going to try to pass it off and say, well, I'm not a rich person. The idea, the principle here is be ready to give, be ready to share. That's what he's telling him here. Instruct them to do good, verse 18, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share. Well, why? Because that's following the nature of God. God is always ready to give, always ready to prosper us. And so our character should be along that same line. In 2 Corinthians chapter 9 and verses 6 through 7, we find the other characteristics of God's giving nature that we're to imitate. Let's go over to 2 Corinthians. I mentioned this earlier. When you look at us and putting this into practical application, chapter 9, verse 7, each one must do as he has purposed in his heart, not grudgingly or under compulsion. So God expects us to be loving in our giving. He says, for God loves a cheerful giver, right? So a loving, cheerful giver is the nature of God. God never gave to us begrudgingly. Give me one example that you could look at in the scriptures, in the New Testament, that shows a place where God could have, in fact, I mean, you can go through the Bible and you can find these, where we would say, well, if he's going to give in that situation, he's going to certainly do it begrudgingly because he has no responsibility to give in that situation. So in the New Testament, if there was one place, you can go, this is all the way back in Genesis, there's one place that you can look at where God, if he was going to be a giver that gave begrudgingly, it would be seen where? In giving his son. I don't want to do this. I don't know you all nothing. I gave you everything. And you don't deserve this, right? I put you in this garden. I provided everything you need. I was your God, your father. And you traded me for a lie, for some momentary pleasure. You thought you were going to gain something from this, and you didn't. So why do I owe you anything? But he doesn't begrudgingly give us Christ. He willingly, the word himself willingly chooses to come to this earth, subject himself to the flesh, and then suffer at the hands of the creation, go to the cross, and die. So look at God's nature in giving. He says, you don't give grudgingly or under compulsion. Now think about that. You say, well, isn't it under compulsion if someone is making you do something, commanding you to do something? Right? You say, well, that's under compulsion. I mean, it's like, if you didn't command me to do it, I wouldn't do it. And therein lies the problem. The nature of God's giving is not one where there is compulsion in his giving. It is just his nature. He is a giving God. We should learn to become givers just because we are children of God. It should be just as if it was second nature to us to be people, or first nature, to be people who give. Because God doesn't sit back and say, well, let me see, you're really not deserving of this. His nature is one of giving, as seen clearly in his offering of his son. Now, that doesn't mean there's times when God hasn't removed his blessings, but his blessings being removed was based upon how the people responded to him.
Well, they no longer show that they even believed in him because they went to idolatry.
The covenant, yeah. Yeah, when you go back to the old covenant, and when you look what happens in the garden. God had bestowed his blessings upon Adam and Eve freely. There was nothing they did to deserve those things. He creates them, puts them in this beautiful garden, provides everything that they need, provided two people for each other, provided a helpmeet, all these things that they had there. There was nothing that they were lacking of. There was no sin, there was no sorrow, there was no pain, right? And so he freely gave this to them. And when they chose to disobey him, he says, now I'm going to remove this from you. Did he continue to give to them though? Yeah, he continued to provide for them. It's just that God says, this is no longer something that you are going to be receiving because you've chosen, like with the Jews, to turn away from me, to abandon me. So when it comes to our giving, there are, even with us, there are things that we need to be people who freely give, but we're also supposed to consider in our giving, do we just give everything? No.
We can teach other people how to give.
Yes.
It's kind of easy.
We don't give everything, one, and we don't give to everyone, two. In our giving, God doesn't tell us to give to others regardless of how they react. In fact, in 1 Thessalonians, he says, if a man is unwilling to work, what? Neither let him eat. Don't give him if he's unwilling to do what he needs to be doing.
That's called enabling.
Exactly. So, and I think that goes back to the nature of giving. True giving is not something that enables us to continue to live a life of wanton sin, right? So, when we go back and look at our characteristics of our giving, we need to be cheerful givers, and we need to be people who give not under compulsion. God commanding us to give is not under compulsion, because in the end, our giving is because we love God. We want to give. And that should be our desire. I want to give. When we go back and look at the Macedonian church, in their deep poverty, what did they do? They gave in abundance. They wanted to, they begged for the participation in the sharing of the gospel, Paul said. So, even though it was a command, it was something that they wanted to do. It's like telling your kids that they need to keep their room clean. Well, your kids love you. And they want to make you proud of them because you love them. And so it's like, well, why you clean your room? Well, because my parents make me. Yeah, certainly you're going to hear that. Or because I love them and I want to. I want them to be happy with me. I want them to know how much I love them by listening to them and giving to them something that they're asking for. So when it comes to our giving, it's not something that we should give out of the idea of, well, I'm being forced to do this. I don't want, because then there's no real love in your giving. There's no real love in it. It's something that you have to desire to do. And then again, going back to 2 Corinthians 9 in verse 7, the idea that we're supposed to be cheerful or joyful in that giving as well. It's something that we should desire to do. Something that it is a joyful thing to say, you know, I can give to God, I can give to his work, I can give to others, I can give of my time, I can give of my finances, I can give of so many other things, and I do that with joy. Sonny?
When giving, there's two questions. What's the cost and what's the return?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know what the cost is when he gives us all the things that he does, material things, spiritual things. I don't know what that cost him, you know, if anything.
Mm-hmm.
But his son, that's a big cost.
Yeah.
You know, he with that giving, he paid dearly.
The free gift was costly, yeah.
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 And what's the return?
Yeah.
And his return, I'm sure he counted the cost before he did, you know, but he loved the world, and he wanted part of the world to be saved.
Anybody that would be willing to, yes. In fact, in Hebrews chapter 12, down here in beginning in verse 1, he says, therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. So when you go back and you look at what Jesus did when he faced that cross, right? That he, for the joy set before him, endured the cross. Because the return on it was so great. What is the return on his sacrifice? Salvation of those who are willing to be saved. And that is a worthwhile cause for him to lay down his life. Take a look over at Matthew chapter 6 now. We're supposed to be giving in a trusting way. Matthew chapter 6, begin in verse 25. This is the often referred to as the cure for anxiety. So it says, "For this reason I say to you, do not be worried about your life as to what you will eat or what you will drink, nor for your body as to what you will put on. Is not life more than food and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow, nor reap, nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. And are you not worth much more than they? And who of you, by being worried, can add a single hour to his life? And why are you worried about clothing? Observe how the lilies of the field grow. They do not toil, nor do they spin. Yet I say to you that not even Solomon in all his glory clothed himself like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow sown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? Do not worry then, saying, what will we eat, or what will we drink, or what will we say, or what will we wear for clothing? For the Gentiles eagerly seek all these things, for your heavenly Father knows that you need all these things. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. So do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will care for itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own."
I talked to a very rich man one time, and he was talking about giving and what, you know, it doesn't matter how rich you are or how poor you are. There's one thing that everybody is completely 100% equal on.
Yep.
And that's time.
Yeah.
Every one of us just got 24 hours. That's
Yeah.
all we got.
Yep.
To a day. And giving of your time is a very important thing. It's like I said, doesn't matter if you're rich, poor, or what. The giving of the time, and everybody can give time.
We've got that same. And you know, when you look at, there's a saying, something to the effect of, in life and death, or in death, both rich and poor go into the same ground, right? Or something to that effect. Now, certainly a rich man can be buried in a much more expensive coffin, right? He can spend, you know, $40,000, $50,000 on something that's going to be stuck into the ground. Nevertheless, he's still in the ground right next to the pauper, who's buried in a pine box, right? They're both in the ground. So when it comes to our life, we all are going to begin and end. We come into the life, we go out of this life. What did Job say? Naked I came into this world, naked I will leave, right? The Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. So it's what we do in between, right? What we do in between those moments that defines where we spend eternity. Therein lies a difference. Rich or poor, we're all going to go into the ground. But where we spend after that is something different. Whether I'm a child of God or not, that's going to determine the outcome. If I'm going to be a child of God, then I need to be an imitator of God. And I need to be willing to give of my time, give of my finances, as God gave me an example in his own giving. When you think about giving in a trusting way, so you go back to Matthew chapter 6, and he's saying, look, God knows, right? And it's interesting when you think about the example he uses. Why does he use the sparrow? Why does he use the lilies? Why does he use the grass of the field? And each one of these things, he says something that they don't do. What don't they do? They don't toil. They don't try to build up massive amounts of possessions. They don't. They live, they do enough to sustain life. Here's an interesting story for you about birds. So this may put a little bit of a wrench into it, but in South Africa, there's these bird nests, and Errol was telling me about them. He goes, you know what these birds, said these nests are in these trees. I'm like, oh, they're pretty cool. Big. They're hanging everywhere. They look like giant coconuts. And he says, you know, the males build those nests. And then what the female does is she flies over and she goes into the nest and she looks around at the nest. And if she likes it, she stays. If she doesn't, she flies out of the nest, and the man knows he's got to go build another one because she didn't like it. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. I'm like, does that sound familiar?
About the same way
I know. I'm like, yes, you didn't know. No, it's not big enough. I wanted 4 stories. So, but they build the nest for what purpose? For survival, for nesting. They're not trying to build this grand, massive mansion of a nest, right? It's not like that. When the lilies of the field, they're not out there trying to gain great wealth. They're not putting all this effort into it. He says, but that's what we do as humans, though. The opposite is that's what we do. We put all this effort into, and oftentimes it's because we're worried about not having. So all this time, this effort goes, why are you investing so much of your time and effort into that and forgetting that, look, if God takes care of these people or these creatures or these plants that don't even go out there and toil, but he takes care of them, don't you think he'll take care of you too? Right? They're out there just living their life and he's providing for them. What about you? And so then it becomes, I need to have faith in God. I need to trust in him. Don't worry about these things. He's not saying don't go out and work for him. He didn't say that. He didn't say don't go work for him. He says, but seek first his kingdom. So put the kingdom first and then go out and do what you need to do. Always keeping the kingdom first, always trusting in God and what he is going to do for you. So our giving, following that example of God, is one that puts our faith in him because we've seen what he's already done for us. Take a look over in Hebrews chapter 13. The Hebrew writer says, verse 5, Hebrews 13:5, make sure that your character is free from the love of money, being content with what you have, for he himself has said, I will never desert you, nor will I ever forsake you, so that we confidently say, the Lord is my helper, I will not be afraid. What will man do to me? So, if you go back and you look at the garden, what was it that Adam and Eve had to worry about in the garden?
Just one tree.
Yeah, and just stay away from it, right? Don't go messing around with that thing. But were they lacking anything? No. There wasn't any great industry going on, right? They weren't trying to amass wealth. But God was providing for them. He gave them what they needed. And when they turned from him, he removed these certain blessings, but then he continued to provide it. But then, of course, when you take a look at the curse, what's going to happen now? Well, now you got to go out there. Now you're going to toil by the sweat of your brow. Now I'm still going to provide for you, but it's going to be different. So going back and looking at Adam and Eve, they were in a position where God gave them. They appear in a garden that's fully grown. They appear in a world that has everything available that they need to sustain life, shelter, whatever. It's all there. And what we might consider them lacking was something that they didn't need. They obviously didn't need those things that we would consider to be lacking on their part. And so going back over here to Hebrews chapter 13, we're told to let our character be free from the love of money, being content with what we